Good morning, everyone. It's good to see this classroom at the Drake Community Library in Grinnell filled to the brim again this morning. Appreciate your being here. I'm Joanne Gandhi. I chair the Community Education Council, which sponsors the bucket courses for you. And our hardworking planning committee, who makes all of this possible, joins me in welcoming you to the bucket courses. If you would take just a minute right now and check your cell phones to make sure they are silenced, we will all appreciate that. So please silence your cell phones. You know, one of the things that's interesting about this course in leadership and crisis is the fact that we are talking about leaders who are so familiar to all of us that all you have to do is say one name and everybody knows who you're talking about, like Abe and Mandela and Gandhi and King. Now we have a little more problem with George Washington, because in the Grinnell community, and certainly in the college community, when you refer to George, everyone thinks you're talking about George Drake. As a matter of fact, if you're not talking about George Drake, you'd better clarify it, because otherwise you'll have a very confusing conversation. It makes my job really easy, though, because when I introduce the speaker for the second class of the bucket course, Leadership in Crisis, all I have to say is, here's George.
We had a little problem with the equipment this morning, so I've got this in my pocket rather than on my belt. Have any of you ever noticed that most of the jerks on television are called George? Sue and I have. I think particularly of Seinfeld, but not exclusively. So, you know, one has to work hard to overcome the name, as in the case of George Washington. Welcome to all of you, friends and neighbors, and also to those who we hope, when this all is said and done, will be watching this on the college website. And as part of that, I will be probably repeating more than would be normal in our bucket courses. Certainly repeating the questions, but if we have, and I hope we'll have some time for discussion this morning, I'll try to summarize what's been being said in the discussion, so that those who are reliant on doing this through electronic media can track what's going on. Otherwise, if I'm not talking, or someone through the audio system, then folks watching it don't. It's just a big empty space. So I'll try to keep up with that. I have to confess, I guess I'll say confess. Joanne has said from the beginning, if I need 5 lectures, take them. Originally this was going to be a 5-lecture series, and then because of snow days and so on, and wanting to work Don Smith, and I said, well, I can do 4. Ha ha. I always get behind, and I'm already behind, so we are going to do a 5th lecture for those of you who have the stamina, fortitude, or whatever it is to stay with it. Because today I wanted to pick up with George Washington where we left off last time, and then get into Abraham Lincoln. I suspect we won't entirely finish Lincoln. To say a word about the handouts that are before you. We did have some supplemental handouts from last Wednesday that are available to you, and I think they may have been given out at the table as they came in. And then a new handout, which is selections from this particular book by Michael Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, Slavery in the Civil War, and it is extracts from Lincoln's letters and speeches predominantly. And then I have selected a few of those for the Xeroxes that you have before you, and we will look at most of the contents of those Xeroxes as we go through, and I'll try to be explicit in the directions I give you to find where we are. They are quite consecutive in terms of how they were Xeroxed. Now, to go back to George Washington for a few moments at least, and to summarize where we left off last time. I think we were, after all those preliminary things that I had done, then we got into Washington's life, some basic aspects of it that are interesting and certainly do have an impact on his leadership. 8th grade education, and I saw some eyes go up there, because this was not a period where people in the aristocracy were ill-educated. In fact, we think of, quote, the Founding Fathers as a highly educated group. A number of them graduates of William and Mary. James Madison was a Princeton graduate. These were college graduates at a time when the Enlightenment was flourishing and when education was a serious matter and when people took it on board, at a time when in society generally there was a lot of faith in reason and what reason could accomplish. And that's an important part of the Washington story and of the story of the period, because in undertaking something like the United States Constitution, these folks have to have a lot of chutzpah and confidence that in fact applying the human imagination and rationality to the issue of how one should govern oneself will lead to good results and lasting results. And in fact, we as Americans would probably say, yeah, the results were pretty good. But Washington was, of this great generation, probably the least well educated in a formal sense. And yet, as I said last time, and as I'll repeat today, that group regarded him as the first among equals. That they really did have the highest admiration for him. And that's one of the difficulties that we in the 21st century have in trying to assess Washington's leadership qualities, because they aren't as obvious as, well, when we get into Lincoln, it's a little more obvious just in the artifacts that we have, his writings, why you could see him as a great leader. Probably the greatest craftsperson of the American language, of the English language, that has ever occupied the presidency. And of course, we're going to talk about him. He had less than 1 year of formal education. So formal education, I hate to say this as a college person, formal education isn't everything. But with Washington, we can't, for example, the personal side of his life, after he died, Martha destroyed all of his letters. So we have none of that. And what we do have, and what Washington hired 2 editors to do, are the compilation of his, sort of dispatches and orders as commander-in-chief, and of course we have some presidential records. But all of the things that he did in commanding the Continental Army during the American Revolution, everything he wrote was then, he took care to hire 2 people to put all that together, but it's deadening stuff. And if you're a military historian, Jim might find that a lot of fun to look at, but if you're not a military historian, it's not of really great interest. So, the use of what he wrote is not a great avenue into understanding the depth of the man, but so it's really his presence, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So anyway, to get back to this summary, we talked about the fact that he had an 8th grade education. Originally, he was not the heir to the property at Mount Vernon, but because his half-brother, Lawrence, died, George Washington did inherit and become a significant landowner, and then he had the wit to marry the wealthiest widow in Virginia in 1759, Martha, and that brought a huge amount of land in, and then finally, because of his service in the French and Indian War with the British, he was awarded land in the western frontier. So he was, in fact, one of the greatest landowners of the period. And I think I also mentioned last time that he is something of a land grubber, but not a money grubber. Because he did a lot that he did, he refused to accept salary for. But if it came to land, then he was much more attentive to his own personal interests. And I think I said last time, I'll certainly repeat it now, that for both the Grinnell College students and the students at the Newton Correctional Facility, that really turns them off. They found Washington by far the least appealing of the leaders that we'll be discussing in this course. And yet, we think of him as the founder of our country. The Ellis biography described it as, Washington is in our wallets, but not in our hearts. Today it gets complicated in our image because we think when we hear the word Washington, we think of inside the Beltway. And so we're thinking of national politics and all of the disgust that we have for the inability of Washington politicians to get things done that we think they ought to get done. So you get this negativism that surrounds the name Washington, as well as our inability, at least my inability, to penetrate as deeply into his psyche and persona as I would like or we would like. Now, let's see, I want to make sure, yeah, here we go. Where I was last time and where I want to pick up right now is a little bit about the consignment system that dominated the planters in Tidewater, Virginia in this colonial period. And that was, virtually all of them were growing tobacco, which lent itself to a slave economy. Then they sold their tobacco to British merchants. And these British merchants obviously were very, very foresighted and very, very good, because they also, they didn't really pay these planters very much. They would send them back things from Britain that they wanted. So it was an exchange of tobacco for goods, other goods. There was some money involved, but the person who was managing man was Carey in London, who was managing that, set the prices. He set the prices for the tobacco and how much you got in return for the tobacco that you sent. So Washington and the other planters felt victimized, and the vast majority of them were debtors to the British. And that's one of the things that's going to fuel the American Revolution. The Virginians owed more debts to Britain than any other of the colonies. And there might be a certain gain. If you could separate yourself from Britain, you might not have to pay your debts. I mean, there's that. But in Washington's case, he managed to avoid heavy debt, and he also decides that actually this business of doing tobacco with consignment is not a very profitable thing. So he gradually moves to the production of grain on both, less on Martha's plantations, but certainly at Mount Vernon and the land that he directly controlled, which again, we talked a little bit about the fact that he frees his slaves in his will at Martha's death, and I mentioned that was a kind of a dangerous thing to do because the slaves are feeding her and so on, and who knows what might happen to hasten her death, and therefore their freedom. But it means increasingly he doesn't need the services of his slaves, his field slaves, because grain doesn't require nearly as much manual labor as the tobacco did. Plus, it actually, as we know, tobacco depletes soil badly, and if you get various kinds of grains, you establish rotation systems and so on, you actually can be much more economical with the land that you have. Now, the reason I'm bringing this out is that someone of Washington's stature and wealth, to become a revolutionary is really dangerous. You've got a lot to lose in joining the revolution. And yet he becomes a leader of the revolutionary movement. So what motivates him to take that kind of risk? Because it's a big risk. And eventually, when he is assigned, I guess, the assignment of general of the Continental Army, then his neck is really in the noose if they lose, because he's one of the primary criminals, as far as the British are concerned. Well, this is resentment at the consignment system. It's clearly one of the things that turns him off the British. Another thing that I think turns him off is the way that he was treated as essentially a major in the British Army, a colonial in the British Army during the French and Indian War. He was a man of immense pride and self-confidence. And to be treated in a very subordinate way and to be sort of tolerated. He had experience of the backwoods kinds of fighting that characterized that war, and the British did not. So he felt they should have listened to him much more than they did. They suffered a lot of defeats in which he was involved. The great one is the Braddock defeat at what is today Pittsburgh, and where Washington does rally in the retreat. His principal role there is to help the retreat. I think that the experience, even though he got land out of it, I mean, he was remunerated for what he did, the experience nevertheless gave him a kind of anti-British feeling that they don't respect me, and they ought to respect me, and in other words, a resentment there. And then one of the things we'll talk about with Washington is he's got a Western focus. Think of this for a moment. These colonies are tied to Britain. They are, British descendants. They're looking across the Atlantic. That's the orientation of the colonies. But some people in the colonies are looking west to the possibilities for expansion. And Washington is one of those, partially because he's got land out there, but he's also had military experience and surveying experience on the frontier. And the British, and again you can sort of understand this, they want to assert as much control as possible. And particularly after the end of the French and Indian War, when essentially the threat of France has been significantly reduced, because that's the defeat, the French are the defeated power. The British are much more assertive with the colonies to help them, you ought to help pay for what we've just done for you, which is defend you from the French. But also the colonists now feel less obliged to the British for protection because they no longer are facing quite the same French threat. And so they're more willing to assert their independence in their own direction. The British want to control that frontier. Who is responsible for the frontier? Who should seize the opportunity of the frontier? Should it be the colonies, which are there and can move in a sort of organic fashion west? Or should it be the British, who are the overarching controlling force and who want to decide what happens with that frontier territory rather than letting the colonists decide it for themselves? And so there's a constant assertion of a restraint on the colonies with respect to the West, and Washington doesn't like that either. So at least I'll say I can identify at least three elements that are there in Washington's experience that would cause him to join with the revolutionaries. In any case, that is what he does. And he is almost, well, it's not automatic, but there aren't very many other choices within the colonies to command their army. They don't have anyone who's ever commanded an army. They have militia commanders, and the only command that Washington ever had was colonel of the Virginia Regiment, which was a Virginia militia. So there he was in command of a unit. But otherwise, he was really a staff officer for the British. But he had about as much experience as anybody, probably more than almost anybody. He was well respected in Virginia society, and Massachusetts, where we've just been through Patriots' Day and the Boston Marathon and all of that. We're certainly aware of that at this moment. Most of the raw conflict, things like the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, and so on, are occurring in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, the real thorn in the side of the British. The Virginians are a little more aristocratic, a little more, what shall I say, reserved with respect to their opposition, and are these Puritans and from Massachusetts. So Massachusetts is sort of taking the lead and doing the things that are going to lead to the Confederation and sort of drag the other colonies into it. Well, if you're going to drag the other colonies in, you need Virginia, the biggest of the colonies, the wealthiest of the colonies. It's just pretty hard to fight a revolution against the British without Virginia. Let's pick a Virginian to command the army. So again, Washington benefits from the politics of the revolution. He was, historians love to talk about the fact that he lost more battles than almost any great general in American history, probably more than any significant general in American history. He lost most of his battles in the Revolutionary War, particularly early on. Again, this is Washington, 6'4", really strong, wonderful person in the field who never gets hurt. We can take these guys. And this is sort of strange because he really had learned the kind of Fabian tactics and you know, let's hide behind trees, let's hit and run, this kind of thing, which he was advising the British to do during the French and Indian War. But then when he has the opportunity to take the British on, he wants to confront them directly. And therefore, particularly in New York, where he's lucky that his army wasn't totally annihilated. But Howe didn't seize the opportunity. He had encircled the Continental Army and destroy it right at the very beginning. They'd had some successes outside Boston, but when they got down to New York, which is where New York was a tough place because there were more loyalists in New York. The British had more sort of operational aspects on the ground in New York and so on. It was a tough place to confront the British. And Washington's subordinate generals were counseling him almost from the very start, there's no way that we can take on the British regulars and win and do it in a frontal kind of stuff. Britain is the greatest power in the world, even though they're fighting 3,000 miles from home. They nevertheless have a great navy that can bring them over and supply them and so on. They know how to fight in the open. Let's not take them on. Let's hit and run. And Washington is slowly accepts that strategy. But it took him quite a bit of time to accept that. In the meantime, the Continental Army barely survived. Washington didn't like militia, even though the militia commander says you can't trust militia. Well, at Saratoga, where Washington was not, where Horatio Gates was the commander, there were about 5,000 regulars and 12,000 Massachusetts militia. And that was the great defeat. Burgoyne is badly defeated at Saratoga in 1777. Absolutely critical victory that Washington had almost nothing to do with, which prevented the British from dividing along the Hudson the New England states from the rest of the states, colonies. I guess they're calling themselves states at this point. So that's critical in being able to keep the Hudson Valley open, but it also is critical because that's when the French decide maybe these folks can do it, and we can get at the British by helping them. And the French didn't love us, but they hated the British. So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And there's no way we would have won the revolution without French help. So that was critical. But again, Washington was not, directly involved or even a major force in the Battle of Saratoga, the key battle of the Revolution, except for at the very end. So he finally does accept this sort of hit and run style because if you think about it from a strategic point of view, it's a little like, well, I mean, we've got plenty of examples in our own memory. Vietnam. All the Vietnamese had to do was outlast us. To a degree, Iraq. We may find out to a degree Afghanistan. When you're trying to fight that kind of war, that distant from your own base and your own home, that distant from the personal involvement and commitment of your citizenry, then the people you're fighting against, what they have to do is survive. They just have to outlast you. And that's in fact what happened in the American Revolution. 8 years of war. And the British were not able to conquer us. And finally you get to the point, it's just not worth it. Why are we doing it? Let them go. They've been nothing but trouble for us from the beginning anyway. And we can still trade with them. In fact, trade between Britain and the United States was greater than the trade between the colonies. And so, and from an economic point of view, Britain didn't lose out at all, really, ultimately. So Washington, when he joins with that way of thinking, he does have a winning strategy at hand, and he affects it pretty well. Now, I'm going to move on from the Revolution to the period of Constitution making and Washington's presidency. In a way, you could argue that the greatest thing Washington ever did was to resign his commission in 1783 after the Treaty of Paris. There was a huge concern in these nascent states about a monarch. And the image of executive authority is a monarchical image of executive authority. It's pretty much what was around the world, around the European world to look at. There wasn't very much democracy to look at. The Dutch a bit, the Swiss a bit, but the great powers in Europe were monarchies. The most immediate model that the Americans to look at to was the English Civil War of the 1640s and 50s. And really, when you think about where you are now, 1783, you're not that far from it. It's a century, it's over a century, but still it's in a sense within living memory, almost living memory. It's definitely in the memory of people from the British Empire. What happened in the English Civil War? The leader, the military leader of the parliamentary forces, a man named Oliver Cromwell, cut off the king's head, and Oliver Cromwell replaced the king as the Lord Protector of England. So the only time the British haven't had an executive monarch was in the Cromwellian period. After Washington times, we're going to see Napoleon. That's where the French Revolution is headed. The military leader who's going to emerge as the political leader. And, the countless examples of that in history. So the expectation is that Washington might well step forward and try to be the dictator, the king, or whatever of the United States. He immediately resigns his commission, goes back to Mount Vernon, and becomes the Virginia planter again. So that creates a real sense of confidence and hope within these nascent states that in fact they can launch another form of government than just a monarchy. And so that's a huge contribution that Washington makes to our history. And again, it's the complexity of the man. There's no lack of pride. He had as much drive as Oliver Cromwell. I know a lot more about Cromwell than I do Washington, by the way. But he was kind of individual you would expect to seize that opportunity. But he didn't do it. And so that's, again, part of the respect that he enjoys with his contemporaries. But when it comes to deciding what the government of this country should be, he is going to be one of those who will drive toward a strong national government. The Articles of Confederation were drawn up during the Revolution and were in place and approved as the Revolution finished. So that was the Constitution of the United States. And without going into it in any great detail, just to mention that it did not have an executive, and that it had so many guarantees of state rights that there was almost no power within the federal government, the national government, to collect taxes. They had the right to collect taxes, but the states had the rights to refuse to pay them. As I think it was Hamilton described, it was really sort of a treaty among the states. The Articles of Confederation was a treaty that didn't even control foreign policy. The states had their own navies, they had their own militias, they were supposed to join together on foreign policy, but they didn't do it very well. Washington had this really searing experience during the Revolution that the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, was never able to pay the army. And the ability, even when confronted by the British threat in the Revolution, to collect taxes in order to support the effort to attain independence was severely limited by the Articles of Confederation and the rights of the states to refuse this, that, and the other thing. And these are fractious states. They have different histories, really big different histories, different religious attitudes. Anyone who studies colonial history, each one of these has a separate foundation and a separate history, and not a separate culture totally, but there were cultural differences among them. So how do you draw all that together in some sort of assemblage that will actually form a nation and act as a nation? So there's a lot of the leaders that emerged from the Revolution are very anti-Articles of Confederation, and number one anti was George Washington. He really didn't like the Articles of Confederation. So when particularly James Madison, to a lesser degree Jefferson, are talking about what they should do, a lot of those meetings, a lot of those discussions took place in Mount Vernon under Washington's teachers. So in 1787, they managed to persuade the Congress, the Continental Congress, to call a convention to revive the Articles of Confederation. Well, particularly Madison and the Virginia group walk into that convention with no intention of revising the Articles of Confederation. They're going to throw them out, start over, and they come in with a Virginia plan, designed by Madison, presented by Randolph. Madison was one of these persons he was very young, but also quite capable of taking a lesser obvious role, but to be very much a strength behind the scenes. And they persuade George Washington to chair the Constitutional Convention. And I think I've said this in your hearing more than once, that the only recorded intervention of Washington, it was Madison who was taking the notes, because they didn't have an official note taker, and it was a secret meeting. They weren't going to tell anybody what they were up to. That it was just toward the end of the convention when he enters in with a suggestion that the number of people represented in the House of Representatives shouldn't be 40,000 but 30,000, therefore to have more representatives in the House. Well, I'm not going to get into the convention business, but just to say that one of the things that the National Constitution does is to waving we got to stop in just a few minutes, but try to find the right spot. One of the things it does is to create an executive. And when you look at the Constitution, there's this long Article 1 about the Congress, the legislature. Their whole notion at this point is legislative power. And what are the limits on legislative power? What are the possibilities and powers of the legislature? And by the way, I guess we'll accept an executive. And this is probably Washington's second great contribution. There's no question that they had in mind that that executive would be George Washington. They trusted him. And that they don't want to trust a strong executive. They want a relatively weak executive. And therefore, it's why today you have all of these constitutional arguments, constitutional lawyers about imperial presidency, executive power, because the presidency now has pushed hard against the restrictions that the Constitution places on it. There are constitutional restrictions, but that you're trying to move against them as forcefully as possible in today's contemporary politics. Washington was quite satisfied with the way the executive was defined. They even had to invent the name. What are you going to call the executive? Oh, let's call the executive a kind of presider, a president. So, and that's where the word comes from, is to preside. You aren't necessarily the powerful executive, you're just going to preside. He's been presiding over the Constitutional Convention, let's let him preside over the country. But Washington has very strong ideas about what the national government should be doing, what it should do. He hated the idea of parties. But in fact, by his second term, parties do develop. And you're going to have a party that Washington and Hamilton represent, which are called the Federalists, who believe in strong national power. They actually stole the march on their opponents by taking the name Federalists, because that doesn't sound so bad as nationalist. You're accepting it's a federal system. There are states' powers, there are national powers. So if you call yourself a nationalist, what are the states? But if you're a federalist, well then we accept the states, we accept the nation. So the other party, which is going to be led by Jefferson and gradually acquire James Madison as, he's not quite as far this direction, but he moves that way, is going to be the Republicans at that time, called the Republicans. It's so curious today that the party of Jefferson is now thought of, you have Jefferson-Jackson Day as the Democratic Party celebration. So today's Democratic Party traces its roots back to Jefferson, yet if you were to look at the politics of the time, it's much more the Federalists believing in strong national government versus state rights or, quote, individual liberties. But Jefferson is the great individual liberty guy. And not so much states' rights to a degree, but not overwhelmingly so, but individual liberty. And you think about the way these parties started and the way it's just played out in American history. That's still the great divide in our politics. Do you want a strong federal presence and a strong federal government, national government, or do you want to protect, above all, individual liberty and right? You are not going to take my gun from me. It is my right to have that gun, and I don't care what it does to the National Society. I have that right. Excuse me for being going overboard on that. But the names change, but the attitudes have not, right from the very start. So having said that, we'll say a little bit more about party politics and a little bit about Washington's presidency and what he contributed to it. Talk about his farewell address and some leadership qualities. Then maybe we'll get to Lincoln. So let's take our 10-minute break right now.
Welcome back, everyone. We have to thank the Mayflower community for providing our wonderful refreshments. And I know you enjoyed getting a second cookie during the break. But now we're back to the second half of the second class of George Drake's bucket course, Leadership and Crisis. Professor Drake.
Okay, is it on now? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Well, a few more words about party politics, and then talk a little bit more about Washington's presidency. And staying on party politics, I'm going to move sort of more into the second term than the first term. One of the critical aspects, as we said just before the break, was the difference between the strength of the national government versus a weaker national government. And Washington definitely is pushing for a stronger national government. And that, you can see how that would be such a big issue for these states and for individuals. They fought for liberty. And now we're going to get a government that's going to force us to pay taxes. That's big. But maybe, what about the state laws versus federal laws? When you think today, of the ways in which within the Constitution, federal law is used to spread its power over state law. Think of all the things that are developed out of the Interstate Commerce Clause. We hear about that a lot. Obamacare, related to the Commerce Clause. But then there's another little sentence or phrase in the Constitution that talks about the federal government having the powers to do things that are necessary and proper to carry out its constitutional obligation. What's necessary and proper? So the Interstate Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause have been used by folks who want to strengthen national power vis-a-vis state power, or maybe even individual power, so that they become quite contentious in American history. But they're there, and the Constitution allows some flexibility for the national government to do things, and certainly the Federalists were moving in that direction. The Federalists, as you probably know, don't last long. Adams is the last Federalist president, and so there's Washington for 2 terms and then Adams, and then you're into Jefferson wins, and politics are going to change rather dramatically after Jefferson's victory. The other issue that divides the Federalists and the Republicans is the attitude toward the Napoleonic Wars in France and Britain. Jefferson, who had been ambassador to France, was very, very, very pro-French. And he was constantly pushing Washington to move in the direction of support of the French in the Napoleonic Wars. Washington saw that as disaster. He really saw our future as being more within a British sphere than the French, even though the French had allowed us to win the revolution, and he knew that. He'd worked with French commanders and so on. But nevertheless, he saw in a commercial sense and in a larger cultural sense that our future was more with the British than with the French. He tried to walk a middle ground between the British and French interests in the Napoleonic Wars, but he tilted toward the British, and Jefferson and the Republicans definitely tilted toward the French. So those two things, the foreign policy issues created by the Napoleonic Wars and the issues of strength of national power, were the things that created those two parties, and ultimately Washington had to accept that. And by the very last couple of years of his presidency, he and Jefferson had completely stopped talking to each other. There was a complete rift between the two of them. Madison, of course, who had been very close to Washington in the Constitution making and so on. And Jefferson wasn't even there at the Constitutional Convention. He was busy being ambassador to France. So that linkage that had helped to form the Constitution falls apart by the second term of Washington, and Madison and Jefferson have gone in a very different direction. So party politics, as a result, much to Washington's chagrin, it made him just utterly delighted to get out of the presidency. He couldn't wait to get out of it. He didn't, particularly the second term, really didn't like being president. They were, of course, then it was electoral college that was functioning. It wasn't really popular votes. Each time he was elected unanimously. And again, that's another factor in the kind of confidence that people had in him. There really wasn't any other person that they wanted as president. Even in the midst of the party politics, late in the first term and early in the second term, Jefferson ultimately finds himself trying to persuade Washington to do the presidency. So even though he opposes him on almost everything, by the end, he nevertheless, interestingly, thinks Washington is the guy to be the president. Another really terrific contribution that Washington makes is the cabinet. There's nothing in the Constitution about that. As you know, issues of appointment and so on are dealt with in the Constitution, but how this national government will function is really going to have to be created out of whole cloth. And Washington, being a good military man, he wants a staff to advise him and to help make decisions. And a staff which has a function. So why don't we get our department heads to be that staff? And what a first cabinet he had. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of War, Henry Knox, who had been one of the chief generals in the Revolution. Chief Justice was John Jay. Edmund Randolph, Virginia, was the Attorney General. His legislative advisor, not a formal member of the cabinet, but very much a part of that body, was James Madison, who was in the House at that time from Virginia. Of course, his vice president, whom he didn't select, but was part of the electoral process, was John Adams. So you can't think of many presidential cabinets that could match that one for the stature of the individuals involved. And that's another factor, I would say. Even though Washington's got ego and pride, he is not at all reluctant to surround himself with strength. So again, that's part of good executive leadership, is assembling a team of strong people, and not of yes persons, who will help you to work out the policy issues and to execute those policy issues. So that's a major contribution that Washington makes. Then Commander-in-Chief. Now that's something that's really in the Constitution and meant to be an important part of the executive. Again, Constitution makers are thinking Washington's going to be our president if we can persuade him. So Commander-in-Chief, the president heading the military, great. It also fits with their sort of democratic ideas that the head of the military is a civilian, even though in this case a civilian has been a military man, or chief military man, but he's still a civilian when he's Commander-in-Chief. And Washington, he didn't have to exercise a lot, but he still is the only United States president to have taken the field as Commander-in-Chief. The Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 in western Pennsylvania, which was really a rebellion against excise tax on liquor, on whiskey. And Washington, the national government decided it would put it down, and it would assist the folks in the militia in Pennsylvania to put down this rebellion. And Washington led the army as far as Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And at that time, the rebellion sort of just disintegrated with the National Army coming their way with help from the Pennsylvania militia. So it disintegrated. So he didn't have to go on beyond Carlisle or fight. But he was quite willing, as you know, former commander, good horseman and so on, to get on his horse and ride off with the army. The thought of Barack Obama getting in a tank or something. It's laughable, but it was not laughable to see Washington leading the army. In fact, it was the sort of expected thing at the time. Well, one could go on, but we do need to move forward. And let me say a few words about his farewell address, which was put together in a sort of partnership between Washington and Hamilton. Hamilton was, with respect to this party situation and national power versus state power, Hamilton was way to the right of Washington. If Hamilton had his way, there probably wouldn't be states. Hamilton had been an aide to Washington during the Revolution. They were very personally very close. Hamilton was almost like a son to Washington. Washington had no children. He had stepchildren, but he did not have any biological children. And Hamilton, if he could have created a monarch, probably would have. So that was part of the problem with Jefferson and Madison, is they were so opposed to Hamilton, even though Madison and Hamilton had done the Federalist Papers together. But a lot of histories happened here by the time of Washington's presidency. So the fear of what Hamilton would do, and there were instances where Hamilton was about ready to himself try to lead the army and accomplish something. So that exacerbated the tension of the politics at the time, because Washington, there was a sense there was trust in his judgment. But then what the thing that Jefferson was putting out is Washington's senile. He doesn't know what he's doing, and Hamilton's really running things. So Jefferson never directly attacked Washington, but was sub rosa attacking him by saying that Washington doesn't know what he's doing, and Hamilton's really manipulating Washington. It's about the last 2 years of Washington's second term, so that kind of poisons the atmosphere of party politics of the time, and this eminence grise of Hamilton standing behind Washington was a major factor at the time. And there is evidence that Washington could be duped by Hamilton, could be manipulated by Hamilton, but never to the degree that Jefferson and Madison were maintaining. So anyway, the farewell address is somewhat a combination of Washington and Hamilton. And what Washington lays out as what it is this sort of agenda for this new nation. What should we be paying attention to? And definitely, we are Americans first and Virginians second. So the state is subordinate to our citizenship as part of the United States of America. First of all, then we are citizens of Virginia. That's a big step for these folks who grew up as Virginians, not as Americans, or Massachusetts, or Pennsylvanians, and so on, not as Americans. But that's what he's driving toward, and obviously, I think for most of us, what we have become. He was very interested in settling the Native American issue, and what he was thinking of was homelands for essentially reservations. He had great respect for Native Americans. He'd had to fight them and knew something about their culture, but he also knew they cannot stop us. We have a sense, he didn't use manifest destiny, but there's a sense of that with Washington. And we're going to run over them. But we shouldn't destroy them. We should give them an opportunity to live the kind of life they want to live in certain places reserved for them. So that's what he's pushing. He actually, as a president, tried to establish that policy in the South, but it was thwarted by the states. And he wasn't able to bring it about as a federal policy. Pushed for a strong Navy. He wanted a military academy, and he wanted a national university. And he was, at this time, in his retirement, the one thing that he's really directly involved with continually is the creation of the federal city, i.e. the city that will bear his name, Washington. And he is very deeply involved in the choice of the architect and the way where it's going to be. And there's this big argument again between Massachusetts and Virginia, where you're going to locate it. And Virginia said, well, we're much more central than you are. You're off on the edges there. Anyway, they got it with D.C. between Maryland and Virginia. And that was very much dear to his heart. Yes?
Was the city called Washington, D.C. while Washington was
No.
still alive?
It was called Federal City. And I don't, the question is, was Washington, D.C. named that during Washington's lifetime? And the answer is no, but I should know exactly when the name was given. I think it was shortly after he died in 1799. But it was at that time called the Federal City. And I think their notion was that sometime, I'm guessing again, the way things worked at that time, they probably figured we'll name it for Washington when he dies. And I think it happened pretty shortly after that. He very much pushed in his farewell address, our future is in the West. We need relations with Europe. The Atlantic is important to us. But the future of this nation is a huge potential. He really did see this potential for westward movement and westward settlement. He knew something about those regions because he had been there and he had lands there, but obviously not. I mean, Jefferson clearly is, when we had the Louisiana Purchase, is sending Lewis and Clark off quickly to find what have we got. We really didn't know what we had. He was pushing, thought we ought to have federal legislation to support manufacturing, which would imply tariffs. And that, as you probably know, became a huge issue in early national American history. I mean, it remains an issue throughout our history, but as the North, and particularly New England, New York and so on, are developing manufacturers, they're infant industries that need protection against all the stuff coming from Britain. And so they're pushing for tariffs. But if you're a southern planter or from an agricultural region, you don't want the cost of the things you have to buy to go up because of tariffs. You'd rather have free trade. So you're going to get an opposition, a north-south opposition, essentially, over the issue of tariffs. And Washington was pushing in the direction of tariffs. But he also thought there ought to be federal subsidies for agriculture, and then finally he said for sure we have to develop this federal city and have a national capital. Again, it would not be uncharacteristic for a federalist to want a national capital. Whereas if you're more interested in states' right, you might wonder, well, couldn't we just pick Philadelphia or New York or Boston or you name it, that's a major city, and just make it our capital, the way they have been doing with New York and Philadelphia, functioning as the capital in our early national history. So, you know, this place that bears Washington's name, he never was there. He was there helping to design it, but he never functioned as a leader of government out of that city. So, we actually going to have a little time for Lincoln, I think, but let's talk a little bit about leadership, and particularly the issue of, do you think, in the case of Washington, as you understand him, that it's more a question of the time being ripe for someone like him to be a leader, or of Washington shaping the times that he lived in? We'll ask this question about every one of our leaders, and that's a major division within the issue of leadership. And I'm betting there are at least some of you in this room who know at least as much about Washington, if not more, than I do, but I've given you something. I've talked about his leadership characteristics. Any ideas about that?
Some of each.
So there's
I would think so.
some of each and sort of say a little more about that.
Well, the times were there, and then he shaped the times as well.
Okay, so the signs are there.
Combination of both.
Yeah, so it's a situation that he can step in and shape.
Correct.
Okay, other ideas? Jim?
I don't think any singular person can shape times. They can maximize opportunities within those times to their advantage. But there are people who would believe that Washington might have screwed up plenty of things. But we don't think of him as having any problems. We think of him as just successful. And I don't think that's true of anybody in any times. So I don't know that he shaped the times. I think he saw opportunities and maximized them.
So Jim's response is that, in first place, you began by saying, I don't think anyone can shape the times, but you can respond to the times and then add some shape to the situation. And then retrospectively, I think you're also saying that things look better than they really were.
Yes.
Because it's human nature, you oftentimes think about all the bad things that are happening while you're going through them, and then retrospectively, you look back 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and all those things look great. Not everything, but most. So our perception of leadership will change as to whether you're going through it at the time or looking back at it. Ken?
I think Washington had less megalomania than any leader that was thrust into a position of leadership that I know of in all of history. If he had even a small amount of megalomania, we'd have had a king.
So Ken's really seizing on the importance of Washington resisting the opportunity to be the king, because he was not a megalomaniac, as many leaders are, and the importance of that. He even said that maybe less megalomania than almost any major figure that he can think of. So here's this man with pride, but his pride is a controlled kind of pride and a very mature kind of pride. Okay, any other ideas? Yeah.
I don't think he had the
foresight to be able to subordinate his personal interest and to the interests of the country. And along with that, some good luck.
Yes, okay. The last of the statements was, he was lucky. And I think most people would say so, would agree with that. And so, I'm sorry, was the first part, repeat the first part, it's terrible, I should.
Oh, I think he truly was able to subordinate his own personal interest in favor of the interest of the country.
Yeah, so that he truly could subordinate personal interest to the interests of the country.
So
And it's really interesting the way, particularly the Grinnell College students, and this is Grinnell College. You know, the notion of anyone setting out to make money or to really be, to focus on economic well-being, let's put it that way, that, you know, they're kids, but they're also Grinnellians. It really turns them on. It's one of the frustrations that our president and administration have with the sort of Grinnell mindset of it's bad to make money. And so they're immediately, because that's in the first part of the biography, that's what you get, is Washington building his fortune. And but you're saying, really when you get down to it, Washington gets outside himself and does things in the interests of the greater good, as a necessary, maybe opposed to his own good. After all, when he's running the army, he risks his neck. He was going to be executed if they lost. He'd lose everything. And when he's president, he's spending 8 years away from running his estates. A lot of his correspondence is back trying to keep the estates going, but it's a precarious time to run a business. And but he's willing to give that up, and that he really essentially received no economic reward for doing it. But the nation calls on him, and he responds because the nation needs him, and there's that element there for sure.
I think that he was pretty much a megalomaniac.
Aha.
Very much so. But sort of in a covert, subtle way where he could manipulate people to do his bidding. You know, I'm going to resign my commission, the war is over, I'm going home to be a farmer. Listen, I want you to put me forward. And he had his supporters. And fortunately, and there was a huge, like you just said, he had a huge element of luck, and he had the wealth that he could say, I won't take any salary, because he was so wealthy anyway. So things really went his way, and history is looking at him the way he would like to have history look at him.
Well, there's certainly, now, the point made here is that Washington is a megalomaniac. He's lucky, and he's very shrewd.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very true, that I don't think anyone disputes this, that Washington really cared what his legacy was, how history would look at him. And he really tried to shape the things he left behind, including his will, and freeing his slaves, so that posterity would look favorably on him. And there's no question he had a view to posterity, and he wanted to stand very well with posterity. Then, you know, this is why it's so difficult to get at the true person, because you can put that construction on it, that he's lucky, he's very shrewd, and he's in a way duped posterity because he was much more self-interested than we tend to think of him. But you could also take the other side of it, I think. Jim, you had it.
I think Washington was an immensely practical man, a pragmatist. He ran, you know, how many people have a chance to shape a whole new country's government? He had a lot of responsibility to get it done, and he did it the same way he ran his staff in his military career. And so he managed to get this thing rolling. And from that point on, that's much of his legacy, at least in my opinion.
So Jim's point is that Washington shaped the presidency and in a way shaped our country. and he had the ability and experience to know how to do it. And here's Jim, the military historian, saying, yeah, you know, a staff, a general staff is hugely important. You're not going to succeed in military matters unless you have a really good staff and you use it well. And Washington did exactly that with his cabinet when with forming the government of our country.
Well, I think all of these men are visionaries too. He could see beyond what other people could see. And I remember in the farewell address about the balance of power on the three branches, that he was really concerned about how that human nature, people are greedy, and they will take advantage if given a chance.
Okay, now this is sort of gets back into Washington's appreciation of our Constitution and the role that he might or might not have played. But there's no question that he and Madison consulted a lot going into the convention, and that Madison's views, which may well have been Washington's views as well, we do know Madison. He did not, I mean, these Enlightenment folks had great confidence in human reason, but not great confidence in human nature. And that's why we have checks and balances in our government. Because they realize that if you give any one part of the government too much power, and any individuals within government too much power, they will seize it. And so they want to check that inherent tendency of humans to be greedy and self-centered. But at the same time, we're also reasonable, so we can step aside and say we've got to control ourselves. So we will, using our reason, design a constitution that will exert self-control over our more base motivations.
How much of Washington's wealth came through his marriage versus his wife's family?
How much of Washington's wealth came through his marriage and his wife's family? In terms of tangible, usable wealth, the majority. Martha was much, and her estates were much larger than Washington's Mount Vernon estates. Potentially, the land out on the west was very valuable. And toward the end, Washington was able to assert more power over it, but it was more potential wealth than it was actual usable wealth. So yeah, it was a majority of his wealth came from Martha. Again, the students don't like this, marrying for wealth. Oh, man. And Washington did. He actually had a woman he loved who happened to be married to someone else, a friend. And that's very clear, but he went the other direction and was reasonable and thoughtful about it and married the woman that would do the most for him, Martha. Oh. Gordon?
I have a huge tendency to feel that so often when we discuss a person's leadership qualities, etc., we bring them into perspective of our day and our experience. And we forget that Washington was a leader in an entirely different age, not only politically, but socially, individually. He fell into the position to some extent by the whole nature of the development of the Constitution and of this country. He seems to me to have been a natural for that position, and he had the ability to see that there was the necessity of balance between the segments of the country and the people of the country in order to define a beginning. And he sought to do that, whether he's a megalomaniac or he's this or he's that. He had the support of even most of the main figures of the period. Seeing a 69% vote from the Electoral College twice is one aspect of it. And he had the sense and the ability to balance. Those are so important. Today we elect presidents not on their ability to balance, but for all kinds of other reasons. It's a totally different world in which the political system functions.
Oh.
To understand Lincoln, we have to remember that.
Yeah, and I was actually going to bring Lincoln into that. So, so I can paraphrase. Most of you, everyone in the room heard Preacher Gordon. So, and maybe even the folks on watching electronically, but I will repeat. Gordon's first point, and he's a good historian here, saying it's a different era. We cannot judge people of the late 18th century by our own standards. I mean, it isn't a total separation. I don't think you were saying a total, that we're human beings. But the contexts are different. And that's a good thing to remember as historians, as we try to understand the past. And then he goes on to say that Washington's ability to balance was critical to his leadership as he's balancing, and there's this tremendous undercurrent and flow, well, not on the surface, of different interests that are going on at this time. Slave interests, free interests, manufacturing interests, agricultural interests, state, more narrow regional interests, or so on. That all this has to be brought into one nation under one constitution. And how are you going to do that? You can make the Constitution, but are you going to get people to follow it and fuse into this new concept of an age? And certainly Washington's emphasis over and over again, we are first of all Americans. When he resigned his commission in 1783 and he talked to the army, to at least part of it gathered, he said, please go home but go home as Americans, not as Massachusetts or Pennsylvanians, go home as Americans. So he's got that notion of the nation right from the very beginning. And if you'd had a different sort of president, it might have been quite different. And then to the point of, the times being different, can you imagine someone with being our first president who is not one of the elites? Or in this case, he's one of the aristocracy. He is part of Virginia, the most aristocratic state of all, and he's an aristocrat in that aristocratic state. So this is an age which turns to aristocratic leadership, to elite leadership. And there's within American historiography now a lot of controversy about, was our country just created by elites for elites, or was it a more democratic notion? Because the elites are the ones who are making the Constitution. And what are their self-interests in doing it the way they did it? So that's a big issue. You can't imagine someone from like Abraham Lincoln emerging as President of the United States in this period. I mean, it's one of the great miracles of American political scene that someone with the most humble, absolutely the most humble of origins, becomes not only president, but probably our greatest president. So if you, in all those votes that they take, Lincoln comes out number one almost always. Washington's up there pretty high, sometimes two, etc. But it's unimaginable that in the context of the late 18th century and the colonies and so on, that someone from absolute frontier poverty would emerge with virtually no educational attainments, and Washington at least had 8 grades. Could emerge as the president. So yeah, we have to think about the past and the differences between the present and the past. Where's Lincoln? I just brought him in.
There is no time for Lincoln.
Hang on to those handouts, because we're going to focus on those next time, and I don't have to do a lot of preliminaries. We'll plunge right into Lincoln. We'll do Lincoln next time. We may even get a chance to start Gandhi. I'm being, shall I say, nationalistic in the way I'm doing this. Spend a lot more time on Washington and Lincoln than any of the other figures. We're getting India and South Africa, and so I'm going to come back with King. But we'll definitely focus on Lincoln next time with maybe a little bit of Gandhi. So don't lose those handouts, because I'm going to depend heavily on exploring those with you. Thank you very much, and also thanks for your response. That was just terrific. I hope that'll work for the purposes of people watching who are not here.
Thank you. This comes to the end of our second class with Professor George Drake, Leadership in Crisis. Thank you so much for spending this beautiful morning with us this morning. We look forward to seeing you all next week.